Hello, Ambassadors. I'm sorry that I had a mishap this week and won't be able to be with you in Ambassadors class, but I know you'll enjoy Pastor Kim Harrell as he talks about the history of Bible translation. I know that's going to be a great class. But I want to be sure that you have the material that we would have otherwise covered in class this week, so I'm recording the YouTube lesson today. Maybe you want to share the material, maybe you want to do further study from the things that I wrote in my handout. If you like what you see, hit the like button. And also, if you'll hit the subscribe button, you'll be notified anytime I post new material to this channel. Feel free to leave a comment if you want to. Today, we're talking about the Garden of Gethsemane. In recent weeks, during the month of February, we talked about various locations around Jerusalem. We talked about the Temple Mount. We talked about the city of David, just south of the Temple Mount. We talked about the pools of Bethesda and the healing of the lame man just north of the Temple Mount. And then last, we talked about the Pool of Siloam. Now, last week, as we began the month of March, we went across the Kidron Valley to the Mount of Olives, east of the Temple Mount. The Mount of Olives is a mountain ridge about 2 miles long with 3 summits. The entire ridge is called the Mount of Olives. This is something we need to remember when we look at mountains in the Bible land. Sometimes mount refers to a particular mountain, like Mount Tabor or Mount Moreh in the Jezreel Valley, or Mount Sinai and Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount. Other times, mount refers more to a range, like Mount Carmel or Mount Gilboa, or here, the Mount of Olives. We saw last week how Jesus may have passed by the traditional location of Gethsemane as he made his way up the hill that we call the Mount of Olives. The route to Bethphage and Bethany follows the route diagonally across this photo from the bottom left to the upper right. It crests the summit and then continues on down the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives to Bethany. Mount of Olives, or Olivet, could also be translated Mount of Olive Trees, since the word used for this mountain in both Hebrew and Greek can mean either olive trees or olives. And that's an appropriate name because olive trees grew abundantly here in ancient times, though, according to Josephus, all of them were cut down by the Romans during their siege of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. So it's very unlikely that any of the trees that we see when we get to Israel will be actually trees that were contemporary with Jesus. But if you notice, the Garden of Gethsemane is at the base of the Mount of Olives, just across the Kidron Valley from the eastern wall of the Temple Mount. This is a general view of the Mount of Olives as it would be seen from a sealed gate on the Temple Mount's eastern wall. The traditional Garden of Gethsemane is located in the center of the photo. According to Mark 13:3, when Jesus went with his disciples, he sat down opposite the temple. The mountain was appropriately named because it's been home to olive groves for millennia. The particular grove near the summit of the mountain is relatively young, but another grove near the base of the slope has trees that have been planted more than 1,000 years ago, and that's where the traditional Garden of Gethsemane is located. Here's a view that provides a glimpse through the trees to the city of Jerusalem. The Garden of Gethsemane and the Church of All Nations are located at the base of the Mount of Olives. The Church of All Nations actually is erected where the garden is supposed to have been, and it contains a small garden within it of about 8 ancient olive trees that are the traditional Garden of Gethsemane. Early Christian pilgrims located the Garden of Gethsemane at the bottom of the slope of the Mount of Olives, just opposite the Temple Mount. And through the generations, churches have been built successively on this site in Byzantine, Crusader, and modern periods. Today, the Church of All Nations is built over the rock on which Jesus is believed to have prayed in agony the night he was arrested and condemned to crucifixion. The current church rests on the foundations of 2 earlier churches, a 4th century Byzantine basilica that was destroyed by an earthquake in 746 AD, and a small 12th century Crusader chapel that was abandoned in 1345 AD. The current church, called the Church of All Nations, is also called the Basilica of the Agony. It was consecrated in 1924. It's a Franciscan basilica designed by Antonio Barluzzi. And within it you can see portions of the mosaic floor from the earliest churches that were built on this site. The church is built over the rock that tradition says is where Jesus prayed on the night of his betrayal. And it sits at the base of the altar inside the chapel. The wrought iron fence consists of crowns of thorns. The reason it's called the Church of All Nations is because churches from around the world contributed to the construction of the church, and their gifts are remembered by a seal of their nation. Here's a picture that shows the seal of the United States. Adjacent to the Church of All Nations is an olive garden with 8 large and very ancient olive trees. Now, olive trees don't have rings, so you can't determine their age by counting the rings as you can with so many other trees. But scholars estimate the age of these trees to be between 1,000 and 2,000 years old. Now, it's unlikely that any of these trees were actually present in the time of Christ, because Josephus reports that the Romans cut down all the trees in the area during their siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The name Gethsemane means oil press in Hebrew. Olives were the main source of oil in Israel, so it's also known as an olive press. Gethsemane was an olive orchard with an olive press in it. As a result, it became known as the Garden of Gethsemane. The garden contains all of these old olive trees, some of which date back almost to the time of Jesus. Where does the Garden of Gethsemane figure in the Bible story? Well, first we turn to Matthew chapter 26. Jesus spent his last evening on earth praying in great agony before his crucifixion the following day. So we read in Matthew 26, verses 36 and 37, "Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, 'Sit here while I go over there and pray.' And taking with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled." Well, as I said, the Church of All Nations was built over a Byzantine church that commemorated Gethsemane, so its location is likely accurate. This grove with old olive trees is located to the left of the church itself. The photograph here is one that was taken by the American colony between 1927 and 1946. Here's a model of the Garden of Gethsemane and the Church of All Nations, kind of showing you how the actual site looks. And here's an older picture that comes from the time period of 1870 to 1890, before the Church of All Nations was built. And another one from 1865, even earlier. It's not known if today's alleys that come down the Mount of Olives are the same as they were in the 1st century. If they are, and it's likely that they are, Jesus probably traveled down the path coming from near the upper right corner of the photo down to the center, just above the traditional Garden of Gethsemane. This photograph was taken in the 1890s, again before the Church of All Nations was constructed. But here's a picture of the way it looks today. You can see from the Temple Mount looking eastward, going right across the Kidron Valley, how the Garden of Gethsemane sits directly across from the Temple Mount. The oldest olive trees are located next to the Church of All Nations, which commemorates the Garden of Gethsemane. Here's an aerial view of the Church of All Nations. You can see the Kidron Valley, and you can see that olive grove of 8 ancient olive trees that mark the Garden of Gethsemane. Some of the olive trees inside the wall compound of the Church of All Nations are more than 1,000 years old. And they're found adjacent to the Church of All Nations. 8 large and very ancient olive trees that have been estimated between 1,000 and 2,000 years old. After his last Passover meal with his disciples, Jesus led them to the Garden of Gethsemane, where he prayed. And he was in the Garden of Gethsemane when Judas kissed him and the soldiers arrested him. In 1937, excavations reveal portions of the foundation of the Crusader Church of Gethsemane. Here's a photo that was taken by the American colony during that time. And here are the remains of the Crusader Church. The modern church was built directly on top of the Byzantine church, but the Crusader Church was misaligned, leaving some of its foundations outside the building. In the Garden of Gethsemane, they found a cave, and evidence in that cave indicates that it was used for pressing olives in the Second Temple period, which was the time that Jesus lived. It's also been suggested that because this cave would not have been in use during Passover, which is in springtime, Jesus and the disciples may have used this cave for meeting and sleeping. Pilgrims in the Byzantine period visited a cave in the area which they believed commemorated the location of Gethsemane. Now, skeptics note that holy places are often located in caves because that's a convenient location for sheltering pilgrims from the elements. But evidence of olive pressing activity was found in the niche where the altar sits today. The painting on this wall shows Jesus praying with his disciples in the cave. We read in Matthew 26 that Jesus spent his last evening on earth praying in great agony before his crucifixion the following day. Looking at Matthew 26, verses 38 and 39. Then he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." When you pull away from the traditional locations and shrines, it's not difficult to imagine the scene as it may have been 2,000 years ago when Jesus visited this location with his disciples. Here's a picture of ancient olive trees in the Garden of Gethsemane. This picture was taken between 1940 and 1946 by the American colony. A portion of the bedrock inside the Church of All Nations is called the Stone of Agony, and it's exposed near the altar of the church, and is believed to be the place where Jesus prayed and wept. In the Church of the Agony, or the Church of All Nations, there is a depiction of Jesus praying on that stone of agony. As Jesus prayed, "Let this cup pass from me." Now, we understand that Jesus was speaking of a figurative cup, not a literal cup. We go on with our reading. "And he came to his disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, 'So could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak.'" Here's a painting by James Tissot from 1890. "You could not watch 1 hour with me?" the question asks. The disciples were simply unable to stay awake to pray with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Like Paul, Jesus commented that the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Again, for the second time, he went away and prayed, "My Father, if it cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words again. Now we turn to Luke chapter 22. to find a little more information about this prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. Luke records in Luke 22 verses 43 and 44 that Jesus' prayers were so fervent that his sweat became like great drops of blood falling on the ground. Now, there is some question about whether this is an authentic part of the original text or not, but it's one with which we're all familiar. And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him, and being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. This bedrock over which the Church of All Nations is built is traditionally believed to be the place where Jesus sweated great drops of blood on the night before his crucifixion. Now, like I said, while Luke 22 verses 43 and 44 are well-known verses, they are not contained in many of the early and important manuscripts, and modern scholars consider them to be of doubtful authenticity. Returning to Matthew chapter 26, and the story is told by Matthew there. Verses 45 and 46. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." So after he's prayed all night, Jesus was arrested by the Jews. Here's a picture of the Garden of Gethsemane that was taken between 1940 and 1946 by the American colony, showing it in the fog. And while he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him." Perhaps you've imagined this huge crowd of people coming out to collect Jesus. It probably wasn't that many people. Here's a picture of an Arab demonstration in March 8 of 1920 during the British Mandate. But this group of people came out, Jesus says, with swords and clubs. Here's a picture of a first-century sword inside a scabbard that was actually found in Jerusalem. And Judas had said, "The one I kiss is the man. Seize him." And he, Judas, came up to Jesus at once and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and he kissed him. Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you came to do." Then they came up and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. The site near the Garden of Gethsemane has been identified in the church tradition as the place where Judas betrayed Jesus. You can see that small area to the right that kind of sits back from the wall. That's the location that most people say is the place where Judas betrayed Jesus. This American colony photograph was taken between 1898 and 1914. Here's a closer view of that niche and the place where an ancient column fragment is embedded in the niche, and that column fragment is associated with the place of Judas's betrayal. And here's a closer view at what's called Judas's pillar behind the Church of All Nations. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who will take the sword will perish by the sword." The sword that's described is really not the normal sword that you and I might think of. The Greek word is machaira, which was more like a dirk or dagger than what we actually would consider a sword. What we consider a sword in Greek is called a rhomphaia, which is more like a saber or a broadsword or a battle sword. But the disciple of Jesus that cut off the ear of the high priest was using a small dagger-like instrument, much like what you see here in this picture. Notice that Jesus says, "Do you not think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then should the Scriptures be fulfilled that it must be so?" Even though this mob came out prepared for violent resistance, Jesus voluntarily surrendered to them, even though he claimed that he had at his disposal more than 12 legions of angels. Now, the Jews knew what a legion was. As a matter of fact, there's a Roman legion that's called the 10th Legion Fretensis that was located in Jerusalem for about 200 years following the first century and the conquest of Jerusalem. Here's a picture of a roof tile that relates to the 10th Legion Fretensis. And here's a Latin inscription that refers to the 10th Roman Legion in Jerusalem. Notice the words Leg ex Fretensis at the bottom. That's Legion 10th Fretensis. So when Jesus said that God would send him more than 12 legions of angels if he'd asked for them, what he's essentially saying is this: I could have a legion of angels for every one of my disciples who were there attempting to defend me. The Roman army had more than 12 legions of soldiers. 12 legions of angels would be literally 60,000 angels. And we shouldn't take that as a literal number, but as an indication that Jesus had more than enough heavenly resources at his disposal to prevent his arrest and trial and crucifixion if he had chosen to do so. No doubt his disciples and the Jews who were insisting on arresting him would have remembered an occasion when one angel had killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers back in 2 Kings 19, verse 35. In that text we read, "And that night the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when the people arose early in the morning, behold, these were all dead bodies." So Jesus goes on and says, "At that hour," he said, "have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you didn't seize me. But all this has taken place that the Scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled." Then all the disciples left him and fled. Jesus had likely taught in the court of the Gentiles and possibly in Solomon's portico on the eastern side of the Temple Mount. Given the fact that in the Bible we read about believers meeting here in John 10:23 and Acts 3:11 and Acts 5:12 and other places. He may also have taught at the southern steps of the temple where people entered the temple. But wherever it was that he was teaching, the fact is that the Jewish leaders had known where to find him every day because he was there teaching every day. But Jesus says all of this has taken place that the Scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. I found a good video that I wanted to share with you from Drive-Thru History.
After the Passover meal was complete, Jesus and his disciples left the borrowed room and went to Gethsemane. Now, Gethsemane is an olive grove. You can see it right down here. It's by the Kidron Valley on the lower slopes of the Mount of Olives. It's across the Kidron Valley from the Temple Mount, which you can see up there. Gethsemane means olive press in Hebrew, and it indicates that this was a commercial oil operation. Olive oil in the ancient world was a precious commodity, being used for everything from cooking to cleaning to skincare to lamp fuel. In addition to olive presses, Gethsemane was full of olive trees. In fact, there's still an olive grove preserved here today. The shelter of these trees made it a great place to seek solitude. It appears that Jesus and his disciples would come to a particular spot, a garden area buried within the olive groves. Jesus would take his closest friends here to rest and pray after long days in the temple complex. But this time it was different. Jesus was overwhelmed with anxiety. The Gospel of Matthew says that he told Peter, James, and John, My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. Matthew 26:38. The Garden of Gethsemane, here at the foot of the Mount of Olives, is now protected by the walled grounds of the Church of All Nations, also known as the Church of the Agony. It's a peaceful garden among a grove of ancient olive trees, looking back at the eastern wall of the city of Jerusalem. It's here that the Gospel of Luke says Jesus knelt down and prayed. Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. Luke 22:42 through 44. Never before had Jesus' closest disciples heard such language from their teacher, and never before had they seen Jesus in such anguish. The scripture even goes on to tell us that Jesus sweated drops of blood. Now today, the medical community calls this very rare condition hematidrosis, or blood sweat, where the blood oozes from the forehead or the tear ducts, the nose or the nails. It can be caused by severe distress, and obviously, Jesus was in severe distress. Gethsemane, the name of the olive grove itself, even contributes to the agony of the scene. Hebrew gat means press, and shemen means oil. It was as if Jesus' sorrow was so intense that he was being pressed, squeezed, crushed under the weights of a huge olive press. Jesus fully understood everything that was about to transpire. And his prayer, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done, was such an important moment in time. Some have said that that was the point that the entire battle was won. The final point of resolve to see his mission through to the end. No turning back. Jesus understood his identity. He understood his destiny. Jesus himself would be the final Passover lamb that was to be slain.
So I gave you some questions to think about. The garden where Jesus prayed is called Gethsemane, which means oil press. Do you see any significance in the name as it relates to the pressure Jesus was under leading up to his arrest and crucifixion? I found another great video that explains the biblical context very well.
This device looks awfully menacing, and from the perspective of the harvested olive, it absolutely was. The harvested olives were placed into this device in order to create the oil that the average family came into contact with on a daily basis. That meant that a lot of olive oil needed to be processed, and this was the first step in the processing of it. Once the harvested olives were in place, it was rotated, and you can imagine what the olives are experiencing at this point. The really hard skin is being broken. That's the first step in the process, breaking the skin, and then from there on the olive oil was pressed out for use. Now, this particular tool is mentioned in a story that you know. The evening of Jesus' arrest, we see him in a posture and speaking in a way we don't see him anywhere else in the gospel. He's flat on the ground, stretched out before his Father, pleading and saying, look, if there's another way to redeem the world without my going through all that follows, let's do it that way. To appreciate how difficult a moment it was, Mark and Matthew mention the name of this device in the name of the place. Gethsemane. The Garden of Gethsemane is the garden of the olive crushing press. The salvation, the forgiveness that you and I have comes to us as a free gift from God, but we dare not think it comes without a cost. And the olive crushing press, called to mind in the label Garden of Gethsemane, reminds us what that cost is.
Here's something else to ponder. The spiritual weight of paying for the sins of the world was far greater for Jesus to bear than his physical sufferings. Have we really contemplated the price Jesus paid for our salvation? And here's something else. Jesus taught us to overcome temptation through prayer. Do we truly follow his example? And finally, Jesus provided us the perfect example of how we should choose God's will over our own. Do we willingly submit to the will of the Father as he did? The story of Gethsemane is a story of submission to God's will. Here's a final video.
We know Jesus prayed a lot to God, his Father. There are several places in the Bible where it says Jesus would go off by himself and pray, but we don't know what he said in many of those prayers. There is, however, one prayer that Jesus made to God, and we do know what he said. It was actually several prayers at night in a garden before he would be nailed to a cross. Today, let's visit the Garden of Gethsemane. Imagine it's nighttime, and you're just outside Jerusalem in the Garden of Gethsemane. Today, there are lights and cars and people all around. But when Jesus was in the garden about 2,000 years ago, it would have been dark and very quiet. The Garden of Gethsemane sat at the base of the Mount of Olives in the valley called the Kidron Valley. The garden sat just east of Jerusalem, outside the city walls. Known for its olive trees, hence the name Mount of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane was the location of a press where the olives were squeezed to make olive oil. You can still see olive trees growing in the garden today. Some of them are believed to be 2,000 years old and possibly were small trees when Jesus was in that very garden. This was a place Jesus would come to often to pray and to be with God. The night before his death would be no different. In Matthew chapter 26, we see that Jesus is deeply distressed over suffering such a painful death, which is completely understandable. However, despite not wanting to go to the cross, he said, "Your will be done." And Jesus obeyed God. After praying to God 3 times, the Bible says he went back to his disciples, found them asleep, woke them up and said, "See, my betrayer is at hand." How would Jesus know the mob was about to arrest him? Quite possibly because he could look across the valley and see the mob coming out of the city with torches. Remember, it was night. He would be able to see them walking down into the valley, crossing over and into the garden. What would you have done in that situation, knowing you were about to be arrested? Would you run away? Hide? Jesus waited in the garden for the mob to come and arrest him. Why? Because he was being submissive to God and because the time in prayer had given him the strength and courage he needed to face the mob. Think about the last prayer you said. What did you pray for? Did you pray for your food? Maybe you said a prayer asking God for something that you wanted or needed. We see in the Bible that on this night, Jesus prayed to God for protection and asked God if there was another way to fulfill this plan. But when God said no, Jesus chose to submit. Submit means to yield oneself to the power or authority of another, to obey someone of authority. Today we're told to submit. We should obey our parents. We should obey the authorities like police officers or teachers because we should obey God. Do you find yourself being obedient to God, or are you always looking for the easy way out? What about being obedient even when you don't want to, or when you think you know a better way? Jesus didn't take the easy way out. He didn't try to escape. He obeyed even when it was hard. He loved us so much that He gave Himself to die on the cross for you and me. We should all be like Jesus. We should all be submissive to God, even when it's hard. Not my will, not yours, but God's will be done.
Well, there's our look at the Garden of Gethsemane. I hope it's been a blessing to you as it has been to me. Looking past our study of Israel and looking ahead into the future, our study of Israel will end with the end of the month of April. I had indicated that we were going to do a study of our mission as ambassadors looking at 2 Corinthians. But I think I'm going to put that off until the fall or the winter when most of our snowbirds are back from the cooler climates. Instead, I hope to kind of pick up where we leave off, beginning in May with 5 lessons on foundations of our faith, picking up with Jesus' death and His resurrection, on what it means to abide in Christ, on the heart of discipleship, and then what that means for the future as we face what lies ahead. During that study in May, we'll return to our previous format, where I'll give you some scriptures to study and questions to ponder, and then we'll talk about those questions and get your insights in a discussion format that we haven't really been able to do in our study of Israel. So those of you who have been with us for that kind of study in the past know how much we all benefit from exchange of insights into those texts. I hope those of you who are with us for Israel but were not with us in our previous studies will stay with us and try that class format out. But in the meantime, next week we're going to look at the house of Caiaphas. Until then, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up His countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.